Hello everyone, today we talk about the logistics of the Mongol army based on the 1299 Mahmud Ghazan's Ilkhan expedition to Syria, exemplifying the logistic capabilities rather than the problems of a medieval army and such substantially loaded in horses like the Mongol one in a relatively semi-arid area. So looking properly at the needs of foraging and properly watering of the army to literally remain in existence. I haven't made many videos about logistics so far. I think just a couple and connected with other topics. Mostly I think about modern warfare, when also logistics naturally comes to develop, at least formally, structurally, in some ways that, however, are not in relative terms necessarily less difficult, less demanding than, in fact, the ones of medieval times, as we will see. And this is a fascinating topic instead, because in fact we don't know, as you know, more than much about such times and places. Like, we know that warfare was waged, that this large amounts of men and animals, mostly, as we've seen, the Mongol armies traveled with hundreds of thousands of horses. So just that tells you what were the enormous supply needs of this army at this time. Yet again, about the strictly administrative side of the story, we don't know much. It's normal. Like, we don't have, I don't know, even for the ancient times, a treaty written by a centurion. That would be an NCO, right? There was all a world that fundamentally, yes, until the modern age, we can't even properly document, but we know mathematically, as we will see today, that was there, because in order to move again these masses of men and animals, you really have you must have a certain amount of forage, a certain amount of water. We have, of course, the information about the essentials of these campaigns, where these armies moved, how big they were, how much time they took. So those are very precious indicators for making us understand a lot about the planning, the organization, and obviously the strategy and also the politics of these campaigns, right? And in this specific case, properly one that saw the Mongols contending Syria, for the control of Syria from the Mamluks, and so, as you know, as war is just an instrument of politics with other means, you have to understand that it is waged also in ways that are instrumental to eventually securing the control and thus the support of certain communities. Today we will not digress much on that, but always remember that here we're talking about not just an abstract reality that you can, yes, measure mathematically, but that has a certain time, right? An army cannot stay out there forever. It has a cost, mainly, in fact, a political one, that is also a material one, but partly a moral one. It's an incredibly complex system to keep together, and so on. The reason why I haven't talked about logistics so far is merely chance. I think in part it has to do with the fact that it's, as we just said, relatively underdocumented, and that historians in general do not care so much about these topics. It may sound even just boring, right? Everybody likes more, say, battles, as I also specialize in for some entertainmental reason aside from all the rest, I avow. But of course, nothing of the whole can be understood if these, say, details, if even though by themselves are really universes on their own, are properly understood. And there are lots of videos I want to make about this topic, especially, I don't know, the logistics of the Carolingian army, for example, of the Napoleonic wars. Also, Roman logistics actually is not very much. Like everybody knows, of course, that all great empires were somewhat master planners at the same time. But it's again an aspect that in general is not really considered more than much, at least in the actual nuisances of the historical assessment. And on the other hand, if you have followed especially my military theory content, that I always stress and care to about let's say moving away people from the concept that logistics is somehow a part of the art of war, which is in fact not, right? Logistics can be carried out by any civilian, right? This is just like an engineer can build a trench, but not having the palest idea where to locate it for the strategical purpose. When you study the theory of the art of war, you study how to supply an army, but essentially given for granted that your logistical apparatus is already there, just as your army is already there, trained, equipped, and so on. And so obviously, even if in reality all these aspects are intertwined, as the Clausewitzian thing that we repeat constantly, of course, politics is, all this is a political act. So it's all intertwined, you can't distinguish them, essentially, and for the sake of theory, it is important to distinguish them, because there is a kind of deterministic approach, which is also very superficial and simplistic one, regarding ideas such as, an army will win because of logistics, man. There are, I know, adult, like 30, 40 years old, those people who practice HEMA that go in international competition to beat each other and act as the tough, rough men that are so deeply expert about medieval warfare because, they're HEMAists, which means on average that they haven't the palest idea of even what history is. But that tell you those things that just emotional 14 years old write in forums. It is, war is won by logistics, man. No, you can screw up everything entirely, even with a fully supplied army. And for any person who has studied campaigns and battles, and of course, most people do not even know where to start from with actual sources and with an actual scientific method, with some academic certification. Of course, they do not realize, because they want to reconnect everything to a big wall that they can't even, of course, distinguish themselves. So that they can act like, it's a complicated thing, man. It means you don't know shit about that, right? So logistics should never be understood in such deterministic terms, because warfare is truly actually a much simpler thing than it seems. It's much more difficult. So what really means is that logistics, even though being vital importance, we will see now, is just one of the many vitally important things that play all at the same time. And the fact that, of course, we can partly calculate logistics different from other matter of chance. Like, it's something, first of all, that remains on paper at some point, that we also are not, as I just said, not really documented about, and we have to derive from ourselves. Mostly we see it after it happens, not really before it happens. Meaning, as we'll see now, like if an army stands on its feet in a place where they can only get a certain amount of water, you must know that, of course, that happened given certain specific things that were done within that army, because there's no other way to defy physics in those terms. And it is something that is, in fact, deeply intertwined in a broader military practice, which we also tend to anatomically dissect and conceptually, in fact, explode into this many different things, as if, knowing them individually had anything to do with knowing how to make them work together in practice, right? You do not have the palest idea of how to command a Mongol army of the 13th century, right? These people did, right? And they did it repeatedly. So the question is that, of course, there are broader implications in all this in the philosophy of history. If you were there, if you had been rising in that context, even if you had to arrange the thing from a relatively unskilled background, you would have learned, right? So we all can learn, but this is exactly the point. You will not learn just by saying stupid shit like, war is about logistics, because that's, again, the 101 level of noobery, let's say, that doesn't really fit any kind of experience, qualification, competence, or whatever. It just means that to you, a much more physically complex system is reduced just to some fixed dimension that is just, first of all, the logistical one, not the strategic one, right? In order to win a war, you have to fight, which is not done by logistics. It's not done by sacks of forage, right? It's done in a different way. And secondly, you can't be perfectly supplied again and being defeated in that sense. This happens literally all the time. So grow up. This is the advice to anyone who still thinks along those patterns and think that military history is a joke for children, that as they are, but of course they do not want to recognize. Now, in the history of the military art, as we've seen also yesterday in that video about the Mongol contribution to the art of war, historically, in fact, a few armies have attracted as much unanimous praise as that of, in fact, the Mongols. And we have explained the reasons why, right? This was a people evidently loaded in a great warlike moral force that they managed to spend thanks to the political genius of Genghis Khan, that managed to essentially coalesce this otherwise pretty loose and heterogeneous group of Mongol populations, which were other ethnicities telling the truth, and to launch them to the conquest of the largest contiguous, territorially contiguous empire in history, and keeping it together for a good while, and thanks, of course, mainly to their military instrument that was extremely functionalized to that strategic rhythm, right? And consider the distances and so on. So this also for logistics, crossing sometimes actually the most populated areas in the world, the Mongols contributing to depopulate them. Importantly enough, the largest literally in the globe, Merv was wiped out. Think about the destruction of Baghdad and so on. But in fact, also in areas that an important part of the territorial extension of the Mongol Empire were not just sparsely habitated, but as a cause of that, also climatically nightmarish, right? Terrible terrains, terrible temperatures, and so on. And the strains put to the armies, of course, were larger. Also, the larger the armies were, as you know. Just again, a more complex system, so something that you have to spend more energies in proportion to, so more than the smaller equivalent by scale, and that in fact require extra resources to maintain, but to which you attach in fact the greater political and strategic importance. So the Mongols in many ways were masters in this form of organization that was a mix definitely of the aforementioned use, but primarily of the causes, this incredible warlikeness, in partly deriving from their objective primitiveness at some point, but also from the motivation that stemmed also by seizing more developed countries that deeply contributed also to their logistical organization, their military engineering, to keep on, in fact, conquering. And that's pretty much what they, at least in the first phase, they were mostly concentrated in doing. In fact, what we talk about today is already another phase, the one in which the Mongol Empire had began its settlement, its sedentarization, its and its division at the end of the day. We're looking at the resources of the Ilkhanid, the White Khanate of Persia, campaigning in the Jazira, in Mesopotamia, in Syria, and thus contending in the process the control of the Silk Route and on the Levantine Mediterranean coast to the Mamluks of Egypt, that however control in fact all basically the Near East. So the praise to the Mongols arrived at a point in a not particularly happy time of history, but also historiography from individuals such as Basil Little Hart, that is one of the greatest charlatans, most incompetent and dishonest and ignorant people that have ever existed in the realm of so-called military history, that in this case shouldn't be even linked to him. There are lots of people who still, I remember at least years ago, there was a guy who subscribed to Schwerpunkt, wanted to make a good impression, said, finally the channel talks about strategy. I read really little art, which, I think you like to write, which also exemplifies, I would say, that aforementioned attitude. Let's say everything that sounds strategy makes me more manly, right? No, it makes you just dumb, because most of the times you can't handle it, right? So if you think that little art, like if you're still at the level of considering little art not having properly entered the broader perspective what little art was in the history, in fact, of military historiography, and in the study of the art of war, I'd prefer you not to even be a subscriber or follower of mine. Thanks. But sometimes we have to quote such thieves like Little Art, because in their insult to the dignity of humanity, they paradoxically managed to make compliments to certain military cultures. In fact, in his strategies, the charlatan mentions the Mongols as essentially the only example of some interest in medieval military art, which tells you the level of radical underschooling of Basil Little Art, again, one of the greatest scumbags and disgusting people in the history of mankind. Naturally, he was wrong, and any person who does not understand the radically violent competence of medieval armies in every military aspect, including logistics, shouldn't even be allowed to write, to express those. I go as far, and the point that the imbecile was making, though, was that indeed, in terms of operational capacities, also logistics and other aspects of warfare, the Mongols definitely made a great show, right? And we were just comparing them regarding the classical principles of the art of war, regarding movement, for example, and how their doctrine, if we can anachronistically speak of one, by the 13th century, definitely would have not been topped, again, in military history by the 20th century German Blitzkrieg, and there is no doubt about this. But it's relevant that, in the sense, the Mongols, sparked this kind of admiration. I must say, from another side, just looking at, say, art and a little art and others, say, this prejudice of the alleged roughness of the medieval art of war derives from reasons that are literally put in perspective. It is to say, just because the Mongols had this strategic projection capability, they had to be necessarily more advanced military culture than, say, I don't know, the Chinese one, of the European one, or even the Islamic one at that time. This also has practically not much to do with that, not just because at the end of the day the same Mongol Empire collapsed, and so eventually warfare goes on, lives on together with humanity, and we cannot digress into the reasons. At least in this video I made more than 1,500, so there is surely something you can watch from my playlists about this, regarding especially the medieval warfare one, of the reasons why, of course, other cultures were equivalent or close, at least to the Mongol military development. Perhaps I will make a video, even though I don't like what ifs, about, in fact, the missed Mongol invasion of Europe that may have happened, and also actually did happen if we count, of course, Eastern Europe and even certain parts of Central and even Southern Europe. But the lack of the bigger invasion plus conquest attempt, that is something much more, in fact, unfeasible, that is normally credited, right? From this we could digress even into the kind of defeatism that seems to have affected the West since the Vietnam War, for which we have thought that at some point, you can't really win some wars, right? It's everything is against you. It's complicated. There are certain tactics and strategies that always win. That's part of the same, in fact, mental sclerotization, in fact, of lack of properly of moral and scientific understanding of reality that still affects us when we want to give, in fact, simplistic and superficial and pretty banal, to say the least, explanations about great historical phenomena that are by themselves unpredictable by large. And everybody who follows history knows that lots of things along the way, altogether, even just individually, could change a lot. And so determinism is never much of a great recipe for historical analysis. In any case, from Genghis Khan onwards, the aspects that fascinated most certainly concerns the equestrian nature of the Mongol armies. Right, these were evidently from a organizational, from also a logistical point of view, very specific types of military instruments. They stemmed essentially from a semi-nomadic culture that also has its own limits that are in part the same, in fact, political, strategic, and even territorial ones. If you look at what even the boundaries of the Mongol successor states remained in places like you realize that they were still fundamentally steppe-based, and when there were some Mongol dynasties ruling in more developed countries, it's because these more developed countries, of course, had taken over, and Mongolia remained the one it was, just like, after the Islamic invasion, Arabia remained the way it was until the 20th century. And there are many examples of this. This aspect is fascinating for the aforementioned reason of how much the Mongols were capable of adapting to extremely different realities. I mean, from Cambodia to the Arctic Sea, from Hungary to the Sea of Japan, and so on. And also how they gradually, in fact, change their political and military organization on the base of the countries where they were campaigning. And I made several videos about the Mongol military cultural influence in the local, in the broader world that they came to dominate, but also discussing at the same time how much Mongol military culture received from these other places, and not always just from the more developed ones like China, etc. But sometimes, the steppes are very different. There are some areas that are surprisingly well developed, and some that are, some of the, in fact, most primitive places in the world. So this was true also at the time, of course. And in general, however, we're talking about, this case, the late Middle Ages. So in times where there weren't kind of, especially among the main world civilizations, radical differences, say in material culture, say between the Mongols, China, Europe. Yes, surely we can't make comparisons, but yes, China was probably the most advanced country in the world at the time. But there are some things that, I don't know, in Europe were kind of more advanced, in other places, like in Middle East, were more advanced. So it really depends. And generally speaking, we're talking about much more similar armies than we think, also because when you take over all these areas, eventually you start fighting also with the local forces. And so you have to learn how to organize them properly, not just to inject from the outside your resources. In any case, the Mongol armies are essentially what we have been also, I want to say, in popular culture, been acknowledging. Large masses of archers on horseback who move fast, furious, and unstoppable like flocks of birds or of prey, or naturally in the fantastic medieval imaginary, like swarms of demons coming straight out of hell, which I think, the sight of a Mongol army would have definitely inspired you in vision, for sure, as these people took a great care and was extremely successful in doing so, providing a permanently traumatic experience to anybody who just even watched them visually. So aside from the actions that were also up to the deterrent fame. However, there was a huge work behind this. It was nothing like a hellish, barbaric, just disorganized horde of locusts swarming without any control. As you know, the Mongol armies were also fiercely disciplined, and much of their success was owed to this almost Cartesian precision in their military organization, in fact, the care tributed to logistics, that of course cannot apply standardly to every single Mongol campaign, and also in different moments within the same, but that still was, let's say, deeply ingrained as properly an organizational form of that military culture, as the steppe peoples are very careful about their resources. They know how to handle these movements, also very long distances, as you know, with all the organizational needs entailed. And so to them, certain things that amaze, for example, the Europeans or the Arabs, etc., were kind of more normal. At least they were more habituated to. And unfortunately enough, as you know, they wouldn't really leave much evidence about their personal opinion. I mean, they didn't write, they didn't read. The Genghis Khan at some point tried to standardize the script, as you know, especially as he conquered various areas that were actually literate. But in many ways, we don't have to underestimate the fact that the primitiveness of this military culture, in spite of its development, which is that's another thing that is often overlooked. You can't be, again, a more advanced civilization but being less military developed than a more barbaric one, in a sense. But this usually does not happen, meaning that at least the greater civilization has the means to catch up much more quickly and effectively than one that very often is just spending everything it has, also because it's so morally loaded, just because it is struggling to survive in a way or another. But this applies to the realm of moral forces, if anything, and it's a very historically delicate thing to address and to compare. So we're not going to do it. So as we were saying, in fact, the Mongol armies could count on much more strength than ferocity, because moving an army made up of hundreds of thousands of horses creates, as we will see now, some gigantic problems which the Mongols knew how to anticipate and solve. Again, not because other people wouldn't know how to, but because they were not habituated to carry out the type of expeditions that the Mongols were kind of used to, and especially with this enormous amount of animal train that was necessary, because it's as if they had been literally living with a piece of their own country carried with them, right? So it was like a moving base that naturally required still a earth to sustain, to draw resources for, like for any people, in fact, and that provided, however, with some also, in fact, possibilities on the battlefield that other peoples didn't have it. So they partly compensated also with other means, but that defined, in fact, the Mongols as the military machine that they were. So here we're looking at the 1299 Mahmud Ghazan campaign, right? As we were saying before, the White Khanate of Persia at that point was a territory that stretched for 3,750,000 square kilometers from Armenia in the west to Pakistan in the east. That is a largely sedentary country, which provided, in fact, with important resources for, instead, the type of more semi-nomadic armies that the Mongols had literally installed in the Iranian plateau, in the more strategic locations, and from which they would draw the core of their, in fact, of their military strength through this initial prevalence of the, in fact, of the ethnic element of the conquerors that, however, immediately began to mix with the local, prevalently Persian nobility that was surely Mongolized in her own way. I made several videos about Mongol history in general, not the military one. We talked also about the Ilkhanid. So, I think I made a bit about the 14th century Ilkhanid heavy cavalrymen as well in the medieval military units type. So you can go look at that. So some interesting cultural mixes that emerged from this connubium between the Mongols and the local populations there. And strong of such enormous territory and resources, Mahmud Ghazan assembled an army to resume the struggle that the Ilkhanids were waging with little luck, as you know, against the Mamluks for the control of Syria. So the climatic event in Mamluk Mongol military history was the Mongol defeat of Ain Yalut in 1260, right? That had somewhat stopped the Mongol expansion towards, in fact, in the Near East and possibly towards Egypt, as a matter of fact, and that had marked a substantial point in favor of the Mamluks, as you understand. And yet the first Muslim ruler of a Mongol kingdom, as Mahmud Ghazan was, and this is part of the aforementioned cultural hybrid that we were talking about before, you know, that the Mongols were relatively open from a religious point of view, as most pagans were just searching for the best balance. They did believe in an imperial celestial religion like everybody else, frankly, but they had eventually was sedentarized to make a very significant choice because they didn't have in the steppe anything like a local say religious administration in the way at least we intended in the theistic world that is also a sedentary one. So this naturally took form in Persia at a point, and the Ilkhans didn't want to give up on Syria, and this is also a general political and strategic story that repeats itself partially in history, right? Whoever controls Iran doesn't give up on the idea that they can take over the entire Middle East and even the Near East, right? And threatening, trying to open a way up to the Mediterranean, except that's where the most powerful countries are located in this kind of halfway that, especially after the Mongols had destroyed Baghdad, would remain a frontier, just like today Iraq can be considered like after all these struggles and, as you know, the broader one between that would later ensue between the Persians and the Ottomans, etc. And there were good chances still, in fact, to to strip the Mamluks of Syria. As we're talking about the also the tail strikes in terms of manpower and broader availability of resources to the, in fact, the great medieval civilization that would start contracting mostly in these years, but eventually the big crack of the mid-14th century. And this was a war that Mahmud was waging against his co-religionists, because even as a Muslim, he was a Sunni, just like the Mamluks, by the way, and as you know, Iran was already prevalently Shia at the time, but it was all a very interesting game going on. Also with connections with Europeans, demands to convert to Christianity and more. And according to the Persian historian Vasaf, who was contemporary to the events of 1299, at least 6 Ilkhanid Tumen were mobilized. So a Tumen, as we know, was on paper. Yes, paper already was around there those times. 10,000 men, mostly cavalry in the Mongol traditional military culture. So something like 60,000 men in total. Wasaf gives actually 65,000. These numbers, I've been reading some chronicles from not just Muslim chronicles, but from the broader Middle East, Near East. They're quite different from the European ones. They often tend to standardize and inflate numbers much more than in the West. But this not much because of rationalistic reasons. This is more like a symbol, like numbers. This has to do with Islamic philosophies and the way they look at the world. In part, this is a concept rather than an actual number. But of course, the 6 Tumens would add up to 65,000. Here, perhaps there were other troops added from local levies across the Ilkhanid territory. Allies considered that whenever such huge expeditions like this one, if we're talking about 60,000 men, it's probably also an exaggeration, right? Normally armies this time didn't exceed 30,000 men, right? And especially when these are largely mounted, even more so. So it could be a little exaggeration. Also, not all units in history, actually no unit in history has exactly the same size of the other, or the composition and the armament, etc. So yes, we say the Tumen, in theory, 10,000 men, but there would have been nothing strange if there had been less than half of them. In any case, this is not important. Still, we're talking about what in military operations at those times was the average big, good seasoned campaign of kind of regional scale. So it's the grand operation, and it's a lot. But I mean, really a lot. In any case, we take for good these numbers because, after all, they're not so bad. And as I was saying before, consider that every time such huge expeditions were carried out, especially thanks to this Central Asian connection that actually was true in the region already since the arrival of the Turkic Gulams, the Seljuks, etc. Every time it was this expedition, flocks of scum of the earth, because there is actually not a better way to call them, in fact, flocked to this army. They didn't even properly need to call them, right? They were just in for loot, right? They were not part of the regular army that was levied according to the essentially territorial, at this point sedentarized, even for the Mongol ethnic side of the story, districts which the dominion was subdivided, and they literally paved the way to the big army by, looting, burning down, laying waste, massacring, butchering, raping, and so on. And this was normal because the deterrence represented by this big army was enough for anyone, say in the ray of some wherever they naturally this army had to cross, to flee, right? Because they knew what would have happened, and especially how much, and we'll see it now, this army would have sucked along the way in order not even just to profit from the war, but just to remain standing because of the sheer amount of resources that it necessitated. So this was, by the way, crossing all Mesopotamia from Iran, from the Iranian plateau into Mesopotamia up to Syria. So it's crossing hundreds of kilometers to fundamentally seize control of Syria. So the way this happened, as I was saying also before, you can never control a place if you don't have the decisive support of the population. The population was, generally speaking, more sympathetic for the Mamluks. At least they cared more about the stability that Egypt brought regionally in the area for trade. These communities were involved, as we were saying before, in international trade. The Silk Route ended there. There were the Mediterranean ports, the Italian maritime republics. That this point, yes, there was still some crusader there, but that was hoping for the Mongols, by the way, to come crush the Mamluks at that point. But that would remain even after, well, actually 1299, this is not anymore, right? Because Acre fell in 1291, so completely at this point, but still Christian merchants are there, right? They have their own quarters and they remain there. The concept is just negotiating, of course, what this occupation is going to be, because Syria is not going to be brought under solid control. It would remain as the centralized area for the Ilkhanids as much as it would remain, in fact, for the Mamluks. But it's still important to occupy some strongholds. So it's impossible, of course, as we'll see, to maintain 65,000 men and hundreds of thousands of horses there. Literally, as we'll see, it's not sustainable more than a few months, and which was calculated in advance because still the operations had to take some time. But occupying the strongholds and maintaining a general rule in this area can mean you basically control it. So when you want to wage war once again in the surroundings, you have at least some logistical bases. You have somebody that has organized the area for you, that maintains control of fortifications, of stocks, storages, and so on. And generally speaking, you have also profited from the control, from the tolls that are exacted here and that are taken away from the Mamluks and so on. As we'll see, the Ilkhanids notoriously will not make it. Timur Lane in the 15th century will do it, but that's also another story. Not completely though, because he was still kind of the head of an army that was in the wake of Mongol military culture. So according to Wasaf, it sounds like WhatsApp, but it's Wasaf. Ghazan asked his men to bring 5 horses each, which leads to a total of at least 300,000 horses for the entire expedition. This is normal. As we were saying before, medieval historians credit 10 horses for a single Mongol warrior. As we were saying before, this is not the, let's say, the normality for sedentary armies. As you know, an elite knight had normally 3 horses, right? Naturally, the horses were different. The Westerners had, at least at that level, a detre, then a runner, then a ronsin. The Mongols have something smaller, but also more resilient for this long range um, trial expeditions. In terrifying ground, the Mongol horse is small, sturdy, but it has big lungs. He oxygenates, so because he has to cross things like the Himalayas sometimes. So this is normal in many ways for them, but they do different things so tactically, so cannot compare them entirely, except they can give you an idea of what the general cultural divide really is, because the reason why a Mongol warrior would bring, by the way, allegedly 10, optimistically 10 horses, because surely the average Mongol warrior was not that affluent, but it was still thought in general like it's a bit like the laws of recruitment. You have to provide with your own equipment, but then, especially in these bigger empires, the middle classes on the longer run, especially as war continues, wear themselves out. The oligarchies take over, and so the latter tend to pay for the equipment of the soldiers. But still, again, these Mongols often were. These were not just Ilkhan Mongols. They came, as I was saying before, also in part from Central Asia. And some of them had, even of the settled ones in Persia, did maintain part of their own semi-nomadic lifestyle. Like especially Pakistan, Afghanistan, the north east of the Persia of the time is quite, as you know, wild. It's quite kind of hybrid with steppes culture that was a kind of prerogative of Persia, but in between the steppes and the fully sedentarized world like Mesopotamia and so on. So that's why there was a good point also to launch these kind of offensives, because you always had somebody you could settle from the steppe that would maintain that kind of predatory lifestyle and would get in that expedition for loot. That was a kind of advantage. And so if you make the maths, you have for a two-man, in theory, 100,000 horses alone. There are some scholars that say there were maybe even 600,000. The point is that, as you were saying before, these people were nomadic. So that number of horses was not, say, purely military functional. That was just to properly survive. He would use maybe just 2, 3 horses, not even, for fighting, while the others were also to be taken out of the way, because what the hell do you do with a herd of hundreds of thousands of horses on a battlefield? And they have to stay away, at least for from the actual battlefield. So what means is that that number of horses is the literal country, the literal home of the Mongol warrior, because he moves with them. He doesn't have a home somewhere, sedentarily speaking. He just moves with that. So he will obviously bring all that cattle with him, and that will be self sufficient for him, because he will eat thanks to those horses. He will get all the tools, all the covers, all the materials he needs. Right, he knows how to survive in the wilderness pretty well. So this was kind of a necessity, and it also afforded, of course, the military means to carry out the typical, in fact, Mongol warfare, which could have not been carried out. In fact, if that amount of horses would have not been available, by the way, because again, in order to supply the war ones, also the others were necessary. So this is the crucial aspect of it all. And Ghazan, as a precaution, added to this number of horses a train made up of 50,000 camels, destined to carry dry fodder, which has about 3 times the nutritional value of fresh one. We will talk about the food requirement of a Mongolian horse, which again deserves a single video, that I even started making. I think I didn't create a playlist, but um, the several videos dedicated to probably different war horses in history, and I think it's a very important topic. But even excluding the camels from the calculation of the animal nutrition, we can easily measure in about 4,200 tons of grass. That is to say, 14 kilos for 300,000 horses. That's how much that animal actually eats. The daily requirement of the army, equivalent in fact to the total production, and that's where terrain is fundamental, of 7,000 hectares of pasture. That is to say, calculated from the 4,000 tons divided by 600 kilos, so 4,200,000 kilos divided by 600, and that is the production per hectare. That is according to an hypothesis, of course, but it fundamentally gets down to 70 square kilometers of virgin territory a day. That is to say, once you have grazed in those 70 square kilometers, you cannot use that the next day. You have to move. And that's definitely what the Mongols were habituated to do. Now, these surfaces are large, but also, if you make the maths as we will do now, tell you how much an army can stay in, say, a region, a province, with some important degree of accuracy. If you think about it, even the aforementioned 50,000 camels seem to us a stratospheric number, right? Yet, considering 200 kilos as their carrying capacity, they could have carried, in fact, 10,000 tons of hay and barley, equivalent to the nutritional value of about 3 times as much fresh grass, or more or less a single week of sustenance for the horses of the army, which is not that few, right? A week can make the difference, and you can also, as we will see, and Ghazan did, replenish the camels' supplies. In fact, according to Wassaf, not only did the camels come in handy, but they were even employed multiple times, back and forth, which means that Ghazan had also set up supplies, speaking volume about his organizational capacity. So you understand how much work across different provinces was done to bring food constantly and replenishing that carriage, and adding to weeks at a time, calibrated as such for the entire army. Everything is done in a measure that is naturally functional, satisfactory, but also that considers the enormous costs involved. Always remember that, albeit we can't make this concrete calculations about how much does a horse consume, and consequently how much it takes to dry up certain areas, still these areas are real places, right? That are of course not entirely deserted. I mean, some large areas would, and in places that were inhabited by people, that were probably terrorized, massacres, deported, taken prisoners, whatever. But also in this, back home kind of dimension, an important effort by communities that you rely on, even for internal government, that are going to ask you something in return. Because otherwise, why should we pay, right? Unless they obviously saw this Syrian expedition as something fitting their interest, and for some of them would have been. Others would have said, but why, right? It's a problem that we're meeting today, that people fundamentally hardly understand the broader logic of politics of war, and they just complain about, we have to pay more taxes, and today we're especially pathetic, because considering the top of gold over which we sit, it's utterly disgusting. But thinking about the Middle East in 1299, there were areas that, generally speaking, as in pre-industrial ones, were essentially just living a bit above survival rate. Well, these efforts are gigantic, right? And literally a single campaign can exhaust maybe not generations of material resources that can be replenished at a point, even sometimes, speaking of grass, during the same season for horses fodder, etc. But in terms of, say, the political stability, right, what it means for, let's say, some areas to decide to autonomize themselves, and causing problems that you have to spend other resources to fix. So that's how complicated the entire point is, politically, even before militarily. And we have talked just about fodder, but the actual much bigger deal, not that the first one is not necessary, but the latter is much more urgently so, is water. Right? Watering creates actually much bigger problems, because even though, as you understand, also these armies cannot move away from large basins of water to remain standing, it still takes an enormous toll to organize the entire watering process, and this deeply affects also the entire strategic, the entire course of operations, really. 6 million liters of water per day is how much an army like Ghazan's required. This is not a flow rate that any river can guarantee, per se, right? Especially in summer, it is not a common feature of many rivers in the Middle East. On the contrary, their variation in flow rate between good and bad season is dramatic. The Orontes near Alma, for example, goes from 337 million liters to 27. The Kuwait in Aleppo drops from 632 at just 7. The Barada in Damascus fluctuates between 34 and 8. And as you understand, this campaign could be waged only in winter, right? Since you can drink only a small part of the water that flows in a river, the one along the banks, because the other one is wasted, right? You can have bridges and things like that, but let's say they're not going to sustain all the people who have to go, and the animals, they have to go there drinking. Again, hundreds of thousands of horses, right? 6 million liters of water per day, right? So this you understand, it automatically precludes the Mongol army of Ghazan from conquering a city even, and just drinking from maybe the river that crosses it, because the local population is functionally settled in a way it can get the water, but hundreds of thousands of horses there unbalance the whole freaking thing. And so you can't even properly occupy a city and say, okay, well, we will stay with our army here. It's just not going to happen. By the way, we're not even talking about the hygienic problems. You can't stay with an army like this for multiple days in the same place, not but because there is no food, but because the horses, the actions and so on are going to create a chemical, let's say, a toxic environment, literally, especially urine that is not toxic for man, but when water evaporates from it, leaves ammonia, and that's toxic as hell, entails that you must have incredibly efficient drainage systems, and or you have practically to move. Think about this when you think about a medieval army, and why, for example, epidemics, as you know, were so frequent, because of these concrete problems. That's what it literally made it happen, among the other things. Think about, in all this, the enemy poisoning wells, the same rivers. It happened. These were, say, not so decisive tricks. You can't have the entire amount of poison to poison an entire river, etc. But you can do it by a certain degree. So always with attritional factors that are wearing down your capacities to keep on sustaining this operation. And everything was vicious. So as always, the average soldier wasn't definitely enjoying this journey. Doesn't matter how much they managed to find to eat. They were always in pretty precarious situations. There is all a literature about this, especially from the Renaissance onwards. But speaking of properly the idea that war, there is a philosophy now that stresses that war was not worth it in this context. Well, war is not literally a business per se, right? It's actually von Clausewitz defines it, but just in the course of the a reciprocal relation that it entails with the enemy. It's a sort of negotiation, but it's not that you actually make war. Like the single military operation is conceived like something to profit from per se, right? It's a political act. It's a completely different thing. You do it because, of course, you want to gain something in the process, but it's not like, what do you do for a living? Oh, well, I go to war and I make money out of that. It doesn't work like that. In case you didn't notice, and also the entire paranoia about the guys who make arms that profit from it, because the guys who make arms do not live in countries that pay for wars and do for it. Why do you think countries make wars in the first place? Right. This is, I think, what the average person has stopped understanding anymore. If anything, also because they are not sent to war anymore, and they stop properly understanding the reason why humans want to kill each other, right? At some point, which they do. Instead of, we have spent 100, let's say, maybe not 100 years, but a good 80 years pretending that, this poor soldier was sent to war, and look, he has to kill another person. He has nothing against. Soldiers want to kill the freaking out of each other, because if they're fighting a war, there's a freaking reason for which they hate each other, and they all do. So let's cut out this bullshit that there are the terrible people at the top, and the people, instead, the people is innocent, because you know that the average person is good, right? Every average person is really good and loaded in this great, highly moral virtues that we all observe in front of our faces every single day. The problem of the world is people, has always been people, will always keep being people. People make things happen. It's their fault, basically, for every single political, military event that occurs, because they are the ones who make it happen, right? It's not that the guy at the top doesn't have responsibility, but the guy at the top can do whatever he wants just because the people make it do it in every single instant. There's not even a single moment in which you gave away something like a right, and it's not your fault for not being able to take it back. Never, right? All regimes throughout history, from the totalitarian ones to liberal democracies, exist exclusively, purely and totally because the people allow it in every single instance. The rest is just excuse of verminously cowardly scum and nothing else. Pure hypocrisy, cowardice, and evil, because that's what fundamentally people are. People are fundamentally evil. This is particularly important to stress. But aside from my political sidebars that are crucial for, again, a channel that bears the von Clausewitz avatar, let's go back to Gazan's campaign. So as we were saying before, the only season in which rivers can't support such a large amount of troops and animals in the Middle East is winter. It's mandatory. This is crucial. Like, you have imagine all the various political things going on. Like, they can't go in the Ilkhanid, in a pretty messed up pre-industrial reality with the degree of coercive capacity and control that you can imagine, that is miserable compared to our own. And you are forced by waging war exclusively in winter, because you cannot afford by any stretch of the imagination to even think to do this in summer, because there is no water. You cannot water your army. right? Nobody will even go there. It's not that you go there and people, you know, die of thirst. People know this, and they will not go at war when you ask them. I mean, it's that basic, right? So never think mechanistically, deterministically, technologistically. This is a secularistic, modernistic disease, and this is what we all suffer enormously from. People at the time knew this, like they knew, you know, that day follows night, and so on. So it was also all modeled around this kind of dynamics, as you understand. So even the territory to be invaded was not chosen at random or rashly, because you have to assess whether there is enough grazing land in the area. And definitely around the Orontes River alone, in the area between Oms and Hama, there are about 4,000 square kilometers that can alone support the entire Mongol army for 2 months, or one garrison of a third of that figure, in fact, for 6, giving the grass time to grow back. And that's the point we were making before. You know, you can use less troops, and those are to be less strategically impacting. So the enemy is taking advantage of that, but they're somewhat more sustainable logistically. And actually, most of the times, just for the sake of theory, like logistics is also pretty similarly stretched. Like you hardly have, I mean, there can be great imbalances in terms of logistical organization between armies, because some countries can suck and they don't know how to organize, because they're just like lesser cultures, and they have less civic cohesion. They don't know how to do things. They're more incompetent, whatever. But again, what we're talking about, especially times like the Middle Ages, there is enough pressure kind of from all sides to relatively flatten, standardize the levels of logistical organization. So say the Mamluks here would have had similar problems, also because in a way or another they had to cope with the numbers that the Ilkhanids fielded, and so especially the larger the operation, and paradoxically, the more balanced the odds are, right? The greater tactical, strategical, let's say, unpredictable outcomes happen, the smaller the scale of these are, right? Whereas when you increase the size of armies, this becomes so bulky to use that you can also do less, as we've seen. Literally, you can't move if it's not winter in this case, and so you have to follow just certain valleys and, you know, certain airs and so on. But in that sense, there are you can, let's say, you will balance more. There will be enough freaking out for you to field enough troops to render the system more or less comparable to the one of the enemy, that, as we've seen, also can lead to more drastic, say, not unpredictable, but more drastic outcomes. Because if you wipe out a larger army, you know, the effects, let's say, on original scale are much greater. The point being, again, that these armies take an enormous effort to be kept up. And so everything can crumble from a moment to another. And great part of the entire strategy is affected by this, and also the course of operations, of course, etc. So when you look at Ghazan's preparations, you consider the right timing, the right path, the right destination in a theater, in fact, of operations that is able to sustain this massive Mongol army for 2 months before the people literally start to starve to death everywhere, including your own army, by the way, in loco. Well, it's all well planned. It's all well considered. They knew what they were doing, and because they were kind of a bit weighted in doing so. Would be interesting to appreciate how this awareness, again, could be filtered, say, drawn, assessed, evaluated, but these are things that we can also understand in a broader sense. There are beautiful passages. Think about one, Xerxes being criticized in his plan of invading Greece because the deserts and the seas would have been the greatest enemies of the Persians because of this enormous, massive man. And then there were very very well known kind of interiorized problems, because again these were cultures that fought all the time. So today we don't talk about battles or anything. It's just saying that the battle between Mamluks and Mongols was held in Wadi al-Khazandar on December the 22nd and 23rd, and it was a victory of the Mongols that even led to the conquest of Damascus, but did not substantially change the course of history, because Syria finally remained with the Mamluks. As we were saying yesterday, actually the battle was fought in these 2 days, because in the first one, the Mongols were largely grazing still, and they held, like with a lesser force, the Mamluks, managing to do so for a day, knowing that on the second one they would have had enough forces to finally come back from grazing. That was evidently so necessary to even make the entire thing being so walking on the edge, as you understand, and well so, because they won, right? And yet in the broader order of things, as we just said, the Mamluks on the longer run managed to maintain Syria and so on. In any case, the irony of all this, and you would expect that those horses that the Mongols brought in the hundreds of thousands had a specific tactical role, at least as we've seen, just the military destined ones, as the Mongol armies were mostly mounted. Well, actually, in that battle, the Mongols wanted to fight dismounted, using their horses as protection from which they could shoot opponents with their bows. This is how unpredictable war is, and also how much logistics has properly nothing to do conceptually with strategy and tactics, right? You needed these horses because preferably you would have had to fight at some point with them, but paradoxically these turned out rather successfully, because the Mongols won anyway, by making their the horsemen dismounting and using the animals as a sort of barricade. By the way, surely losing many horses in the process. This was kind of normal too in that kind of warfare that was pretty much arrowy, as you know, and so this is true also in the West, for that matter, with crossbows and so on. Horses were largely, overwhelmingly, I would say, unarmored, even more so among the peoples of the steppes that, generally speaking, had a much narrower elite numerically, very good one qualitatively, but that could afford to be armored, even less numerically again than in the West, because in the West you have, generally speaking, bulkier armies. You don't have like one ultra heavy guy and 10 literally just horse archers without any armor. You have always something in between. They're also maybe in this sense not necessarily even smaller armies, but they have a different type of tactical segmentation and armament segmentation that invest more on quality than the number when available, right? So this is interesting. We will be talking a lot, hopefully, about Mamluk warfare. I created a playlist about that, as much as Mongol warfare, and talking about the various battles that saw these peoples engaged. We saw even the Wafidiyya, that is to say, the so-called refugees in the Mamluk armies that were often also coming from the Ilkhanid, as a matter of fact, which doesn't mean that we're necessarily Mongol. There were some of them that came also from Russia, from the Golden Horde, Some were, from different places, but some were even from Central Asia, but mostly were this kind of Mongol-Persian background of the Ilkhanid. Because that's what happens when you fight a war. You hybridize a lot with your enemy as well, in terms of many things, right? It's not just military-wise. We talk also about the, say, the Western warfare and how they cope with the Mongols that I made videos about. Again, this is all in the Mongol warfare playlist, and we will see perhaps something a bit more tactical in the last one about the causes of Mongol victories from the medieval Western accounts. We have seen how that comes from more generic history of the places, how there was plenty of Western, say, of Frankish mercenaries fighting also against the Mongols or for the Mongols in these areas at the end of the Outremer states, but even beyond, in places like, I don't know, Armenia, Cilicia and Armenia, the Caucasus, and the same Persia. We know there were Genoese in, say, Tabriz and other Persian centers during the Ilkhanid rule. So there's really a lot to know, and that is somewhat also neglected. But this is the beauty of history, because there is always something more to learn. I have an unlimited resource of information, so we can talk about these things in all the length that they deserve, hopefully. Perhaps YouTube is not the best place to discuss this stuff, but as you know, I make this and I make also history as a living, so it all it all fits, and I'm glad if I can discuss. I decided, because I'm preparing a bit about the Battle of Poitiers that requires a bit of more time than the average, but I'm also writing an article, so I'm running out of time making these videos about Mongol warfare that I think is quite important, but that I already know something about. I can't talk for a relatively large amount of time about, and we will dig a bit more into these things. Perhaps tomorrow I will do something about the Mongol horse, and then I will take a look a bit at the Western, say at the unborn Mongol invasion of Western Europe. Let's put it in this way. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.